G'day Jaffa Adventures, Terry King here, welcome to the channel. Welcome to another episode in the FJ45 Resto mod. I hope you've been following along. We've had some pretty exciting stuff happen over the last few episodes. So let's get stuck straight into the next one, shall we? Today we're going to talk about rear differentials. And I'm going to be fitting a limited slip diff into the rear of this car. And some of you have asked, hey Terry, why wouldn't you just go and fit a locker on the thing? And you have to understand the application of the car. I'm going to be using this as my work ute, which is primarily going to be used on the road, bitumen and dirt roads. And I don't really need a locker in those applications. However, as some of you will already know, I'm putting an LSA, a supercharged V8 in this car. So I want to get the power down evenly to both tires. And an open center diff just isn't going to do that. If I hit the throttle and only one tire lights up, that's just a bad look. I want to lay two black stripes down the bitumen if the feeling overcomes me. So that's the reason that we're going with a limited slip diff. Now, as you probably also know, the Toyota limited slip diffs, the clutch pack limos, are pretty crappy. Clutch packs tend to wear out and they really just don't have a whole lot of gumption. And that is the reason that I'm going for this limo. And it is called a Torsen limited slip differential. And the way this thing operates is far more complicated than I'm able to understand and willing to explain. But I'll pop up a little bit of a GIF or a JPEG on this video so you'll be able to sort of see what the internals of this thing looks like. And it's basically a gear-driven limited slip differential. So if one wheel starts to spin and lose traction, it supplies 100% of the drive to the opposite wheel that actually has the traction. So this type of limited slip comes as close to a locking differential as you can get, which is just bloody awesome. So that's one part of the puzzle. Another piece of the puzzle is a full rebuild kit, full diff rebuild kit. So all of the bearings, gaskets, seals, etc. that I need to rebuild the diff. And of course, here's the last piece of the puzzle, the diff itself. I've got it mounted on my engine stand, just a little bit of angle, and this allows me to flip it over and manipulate it, which is just going to make rebuilding of this diff immensely easier than sitting this sucker on the bench. So let's get stuck into it, shall we? We'll throw the locker in here and we'll rebuild this diff. First step I'll do is mark the cap and the housing and this little tightening wheel thing. Take that keeper off, take our bearing caps off. Now I'm just going to count the turns of this as I take it off, there being one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and a half. Now I'll do the exact same thing on the other side and pull that carrier out. Before I remove that carrier, I'm going to loosen off these ring gear bolts because I got to reuse that ring gear, and it might just be easier to loosen those off while it's in situ in the cradle here. And I got to use the air ratchet because the old Ryobi didn't have enough ugga-duggas. Ring gear bolts all loosened off comes our carrier. Just like that. Now I will gently tap off this ring gear. That's it, that's our ring gear. There's all our bits cleaned up with petrol and ready for a reinstall. Before we do that, however, we got a few other jobs to knock over. Now I've got to pull that pinion out of there. This is where this stand really comes in handy. Take that bolt off and drive the pinion out through the bottom. One pinion. Okay, there's a crusty old pinion seal in here. Sweet. Oil slinger. One pinion bearing. Okay, got the housing cleaned up. knock in these new races. And here's the old race, which I've put a cut in it so that I can drive that down and get that race back out of there. That's it, she's home. One center diff that's been in the freezer all night. One set of bearings in the travel buddy. Grab our other hot bearing. Straight on. No pounding, no pressing. That's friggin' awesome. That's the ticket. It's the diff center in the freezer, bearings in the oven. Next goes in the bearing. I'm just going to put a small amount of grease on this so that it doesn't run dry when it first fires up. Throw a little bit in here on the race as well. Plop our bearing in. Next we've got the oil slinger. Make sure you throw a wee bit of grease on there as well. Next up is our pinion seal. Beautiful, fits lovely. Just going to put a small amount of Loctite around that, the perimeter of that seal. There, that'll do. Pop him in. That's betterer. I got my locking differential out of the freezer, and I've got my ring gear out of the hot sun. That just plunks down like that. Beautiful. And I've got each of my bolts with Loctite on them, and we'll just run all 12 of these bolts down. Now I'll ugga-dugga all 12 bolts down. Alrighty, and now we torque them down. And those little suckers get torqued down to 85 foot-pounds. Next thing I had to do is pull this bearing off the pinion gear. And I don't know why, but I thought these things had a crushable spacer in them. But they don't. That's actually a solid spacer, which is excellent because the torque that I'm going to be running through this motor, I really didn't want a crushable spacer there. Now we've got two spacers. We'll keep them. So that sets the preload on the bearing, and we can get rid of that bearing. And it looks like there's no spacer on the inside of that. So I'll clean up this pinion gear and we'll press the new bearing in place. One pinion straight out of the freezer. One bearing straight out of the oven. Ow, 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 ow. Oh, look at that, it just drops straight on. No pressing necessary. Now we'll pop this pinion in, like so. Grab our pinion flange. That's enough. There's enough there to get the old nut on there. We'll ugga-dugga that down. Okay, so I got this makeshift bar here to hold the pinion. And we've got our torque wrench, which we will set to a 145 foot-pounds. And my torque wrench maxes out at 150, so whew. Wow. What's that feel like? I think the preload is much too high on that. We'll get our torque wrench on there now and check that preload. So our pinion bearing preload is around 7 inch-pounds, and that is far too high. So I'm going to need to add some shims in there, I believe. So I've got an additional 3.5 millimeter shim on the pinion. I've got a different companion flange here. The one that came off this diff had a little bit of slop in the splines. I had that one in my spares box and it's got much less slop. And I'm going to take some sealer and I'm going to put it on the inside. And the reason for that is just to prevent any oil weeping past these splines. Now I really hope that shim works, otherwise I'm going to have to clean this all out and put more goo in it when I put the next shim in. Alrighty, we'll run that down with ugga-dugga. Oh, that feels better already. Okay, let's torque that. Time to blow a foo-foo valve. That feels much better. I'll put a torque wrench on that and we'll check that torque. Okay, we've got the bearing preload set. Ideally you need a dial type torque wrench for this, but I don't have one. So you just got to kind of adjust the clicker when it clicks. And that is right around 6 to 7 inch-pounds. And that is spec. So we'll call that quits. We got the preload done on our pinion bearings. Now we got to move on to the carrier. Before I do that, I'll knock that little detent in so that pinion nut doesn't spin off. All right, I've got that little detent knocked in. It's time to spool him over and get stuck into the carrier side. Time to plunk our carrier in. Just going to make sure that these bores are clean and these half shell areas are nice and clean. I'm going to leave the gear dry because I've got to put compound on there to get the running pattern. Now I'll get my caps and check my markings. That one's a 2, that one's a 2, that one's a 2. Pop that in, make sure it's not cross-threaded. I will come back and put Loctite on those bolts after we get this all adjusted up. So don't go raging at the camera yet. Now we'll just do our other side and we'll come back when that's finished. Now my next step is running this in to push the ring gear up against the pinion. At the moment, you can hear there's a lot of backlash there. So I'm going to tighten this up basically so all of that backlash is taken up. And to do that, I've just got this makeshift tool that I made up. You can buy tools for this, but a couple of bolts and a bit of steel works wonders. There's the tiniest amount of backlash right there. So I'll just draw that up a little bit. That's it. The backlash is now missing out of that pretty much completely. Now I'm going to set the preload on those carrier bearings. And to do that, we basically tighten this side up until that needle starts to deflect, meaning that that ring gear is getting pushed in that direction. Getting close. That's it, the needle's starting to deflect. So the next step is to take that one more notch. See how these have kind of got notches? That little hole lines up with that hole there. This side I'm going to go one more. That's it. Now to adjust the preload on these carrier bearings. Got my dial gauge set up to measure backlash now. We just rock this ring gear back and forth. And that needle is deflecting about 3 thousandths. And the spec is between 6 and 8 thou. So basically I've got to move this ring gear away from the pinion. So to do that, I'm going to back this off one notch and I'm going to tighten this side up one notch. That keeps the preload the same, but shifts that entire carrier in that direction away from the ring gear. Back this puppy off one notch to there and tighten this puppy up one notch to there. I don't feel more backlash in there already. Rocking that back and forth, that gives us about 7 thou. So our spec is 6 to 8. That's right in the middle. Happy with that? Now you can't just measure backlash on one gear or on one tooth. So we'll rotate our ring gear around a little bit and we'll take another measurement. Okay, that's 7 thou. And we'll take one more measurement. Rock our ring gear. 7 thou. All right, we got our backlash measured. Now to put some bearing glue on these teeth and measure our contact pattern. And if we got that right, we can button this sucker back up. Okay, I'm gonna put a little bit of this engineering paste on these gears just to measure our contact pattern. Okay, let's rotate our gears. My Might be a bit hard to tell with the camera, but that is a beautiful oval pattern that sits right in the center of that tooth. So that contact pattern is fantastic. Sweet! It would have been a real drag to have to pull that all down to shim that up in different areas to change that contact pattern. So I'm so glad that worked out. All right, now we'll Loctite these bolts up and torque them down. Okay, torquing time, 75 foot-pounds. Alrighty, that's torqued up. That sucker is ready to go back in the car. I'll throw a little bit of diff fluid on these gears before I drop her in, and Bob's your uncle. Time to mount this sucker up to the car. And time to blow a foo-foo valve again. Oi! This stand made life so much easier. If you're going to rebuild a diff yourself, I highly recommend doing something like this. Okay, I got our gasket. I got some gasket sealer. Let's glue up this side of the housing, and then I'll glue up the carrier as well. Okay, Mr. Gasket, come to me. All right, now I'll glue up the carrier side of this gasket. Gotcha. Okay, let's get some bolts and run them down. Now I just want to clean up any oil that I've got on the outside of this diff housing. If there's any leaks, I want to be able to see it. And if I've already got oil all over it, I won't know whether it was there prior or whether it's a new leak. Lovely. All the oil and grease is cleaned up. Let's move on to the axles. So on my axles, I had these little dust covers just sitting here. This is the beauty of a full floating rear end though. You can take the axles out without having to dismantle everything else. I'm going to throw a bit of gasket sealer down on this sucker as well. Beautiful. And let's clock this thing the right way around. Lovely. Now I'll take my axle and I'll put the sealer on the axle flange just because it's easier than having to work around those studs. Okay, that's it for our axle. Now I've got some grease on the splines. I've got some grease on that running face for the seal. Let's load her in. I did check previously when I had that limited slip diff out whether those axles actually fit in the splines of that diff. And they did. So that would be tragic if you got all of this stage, you hadn't actually checked it and those splines didn't work. So you got your cone washer, got a spring washer, and then you got the nut. These are aftermarket nuts and they're actually 13 mil. I think the original ones were 12. Got that rattle gun on a reasonably low setting because I'm going to tighten these up by hand. I'd rather have a feel for how tight they are than use a rattle gun, which gives you no feel at all. One side done, rinse and repeat on the passenger side. And there we have it. As far as the diff rebuild goes, we'll chalk that one up as a win. I should now be able to put the pedal down and lay 2 black stripes on the bitumen. I should have a much more safe vehicle on road. I'm still waiting on my suspension from ARB. I ordered that 4 months ago and they tell me that it'll be here in the next couple of weeks or so. When that happens, we'll be able to get these diffs set up on the suspension and plunk in that LSA. Thanks for watching, everybody. Keep the shiny side up. We'll see you on the next episode. Bye now.